Well, great, gentlemen. Welcome to this podcast, 1,000 Ways to Lead, hosted by the LDP team of Vanderbilt University here at the Owen School of Management. This podcast specifically, I had a conversation this morning with one of our alumni, Bennet Hayes. Bennet has the most interesting background of any alumni that I've had the pleasure of meeting yet.
Yeah.
I think that you guys would really love this. After he graduated Georgetown University, and he was a professional poker player for an extended amount of time. Also was a freelance writer, and we talk a lot in this conversation about what his trajectory was like, cultivating his own why, but then what the impact of the power of his why had on his own ability to influence his teams and his leadership. So it's a really interesting conversation. I think you guys are going to love it.
That's cool. I'm excited to hear how the poker playing is intertwined with his leadership skill. It's going to be a really interesting conversation.
I don't know about you guys, but when I think about poker players, I immediately think of like what my own poker face would be.
You tell me you haven't played poker before, Bree?
Yeah, but is this a good one?
Yeah, that one's great. Yeah. You do that for 2 seconds.
I just shades. I think you're ready for the score.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm curious to hear, Bree, like if you have any initial big takeaways, just getting the audience ready for the interview.
Yeah, I think that the biggest takeaway from my conversation with Bennet was probably the fact that you just have to be comfortable with ambiguity. And you just have to understand that you as a leader yourself, you're not going to always have all of the answers to the problems that you're trying to solve, but that's okay. And sometimes your role isn't about having the answers. It's about guiding your team to getting there. But that involves you yourself being a little bit uncomfortable along the way, which is, I mean, if you're comfortable in every single circumstance throughout your whole life, is what you're working for even worth it? You know, sometimes the most uncomfortable situations are the experiences that we have that allow us to grow the most. And I think our conversation is a big attribute to that.
I love that. Yeah, I can't wait to hear it.
Yeah, I'm excited for you guys to hear.
Good.
Well, we're heading into their next, so stay tuned and enjoy the conversation with Bennet Hayes. Thank you so much for taking the time, especially out of your Friday. To kick off our conversation today, just want to do a really brief overview of just your background and what your career trajectory has looked like so far, just for some of our listeners. So you started out, which I think is super interesting and fun, as a freelance writer and a poker player. Did that for kind of a significant amount of time before doing a short stint as the marketing manager in Rent Like a Champion, which is very similar to a Vrbo or an Airbnb-esque type company. And then after coming to Owen, you graduated 2018, recruited for consulting, and went into BCG, which is just one of the top consulting firms worldwide. Stayed there for a stint of 3 years, starting out as a consultant, moving up the ranks as a project leader, then did a short run at a startup company called GoPuff, before coming back to BCG for a short amount of time and ending up landing at Google, which is where you are now as the strategy and operations lead. I think that's an incredible trajectory, and it's something that I'd like to start off our conversation in, considering the beginning of your career as a freelance writer and as a poker player. It's a rather unconventional one. And just help us make sense a little bit of your trajectory and what honing your interests looked like and what it was like actually cultivating your why.
Yeah, it's, an exercise that I did extensively at Owen, honestly, was to try to figure out exactly how all the pieces fit together. But I think for me, I went into professional poker after college as something of an experimental exercise. I told myself, let's try this for at least 6 months. Let's see how it goes, check in regularly. But for me, it was an opportunity to do something that I really enjoyed and felt like there was an opportunity to turn into a career. And so I think I was looking at some of the other offers I had at the time and what other friends were doing coming out of Georgetown. And it just represented something really different and something that if it worked, I felt like could be really cool. And so felt like it was worth a try. And I was lucky enough to kind of get off to a good start. And like you said, ended up doing it for a really long period of time, ultimately 6 years. For me, there were some things that I knew at the time, which is why I pursued it. One, like I mentioned already, just that the fact that I actually liked doing it and the problem solving involved in poker is something that's really enjoyable to me still to this day. And then I think like looking back, there were some other components of it that I probably didn't fully appreciate for its impact and opportunity at the time, but like the chance to run my own business effectively as a 22 to 28-year-old, setting up investment strategies, building a poker resume and trying to source investment from external folks. And then making decisions just about how much to play, when to play, travel schedule, like what tournaments I would play in person versus spending, a bunch of time online. So there were a lot of decisions more in line with like running a small business that came into play with poker as well. But I think looking back, it really was that autonomy and the lack of a clear path and kind of having to chart my own way that I'm super grateful for. And honestly, like leaving Georgetown as a 22-year-old, I don't think I necessarily would say that I did it for that reason. But certainly as I moved out of poker and into other areas, I think it's been really useful to have that reference point. And then, yeah, like you said, too, the freelance journalism is another key part of that time for me. It started really, again, as like a passion project. It was not something I ever expected to monetize at all. It never was a significant stream of income for me, but I did it for basically the last 4 years of my poker days. And it did become an opportunity for me to do some freelance work and fit that into my poker schedule. So again, another benefit of the poker setup was that I had the flexibility to pursue journalism and do a little bit of that on the side.
Oh, that's so interesting. And going back to something that you mentioned in running your own business, especially as a 22-year-old, like you're acting as the CEO of what you're trying to do. And I wonder when you were going to other individuals for the investments that you were talking about, how important was it to communicate your why to them to gain additional belief in you, want to invest in you? What was it like balancing that relationship? And do you think, again, that having a stronger why for what you want to do things had an influence on how successful you ended up being in managing those relationships?
That's an awesome question, and honestly one that I haven't fully reflected on. I'm thinking about current day and going through Owen, life as a consultant, Google, et cetera. And I feel like that's a lot more second nature now than it was maybe at the time as a younger person. But it was a couple of things when I was thinking about trying to go and really sell myself, right? And my capabilities to try to get the best deals. For one, it's letting results speak for themselves. And I think that's something that in various ways in different fields is always going to be important, right? You want that resume, that portfolio to fall back on. And so it's not only creating that good work and kind of being able to say, hey, I've played well and here are my results over the span of years. It's not a small sample size. It's also being able to tell that story, right? So like you can have two people telling the same story about the same set of results. And if one person is far more compelling and is able to make sense of it in a way that the other isn't, I think it's going to end up in a dramatically different result. So I think that was a key part of it too, just the storytelling. And then secondarily, I think the other part, especially in my old industry, it was conveying trust. And, it's especially at that time, not everything was regulated. You were entering into arrangements where there had to be really a framework of trust and a framework of kind of how funds would be exchanged based off results. And so I think that was the thing that I worked hard to convey and hard to kind of build a network around me to say, hey, I have a bunch of other people that can vouch for me, just like you would if you were applying for a job and looking for references. You are secure with me. So not only should you feel good about my potential as a poker player and the return on investment that I'm offering you, but there's going to be no kind of back end issues. And that's where, staying organized, just staying credible, I think was a really important second component of that exercise.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I can really appreciate how you said that now it might seem like a little bit of second nature to you, but do you think it was building that experience early on that helped you learn how to sell yourself, not only as somebody to have trust and belief in for just a production standpoint, but actually a management standpoint? Like when you got into the positions of having to lead teams, it wasn't selling yourself in, I can come up with this good output, but it's selling yourself in, I will take you in the direction that will lead this team to success.
Yeah, honestly, I do think that probably has come into play over the last, 5, 6 years as I've transitioned into more quote unquote normal areas of work. So I think for sure, I think the other piece of that is probably pretty relevant in what I do today and the teams I've led to date is just the kind of like ambiguous situation and being able to manage in that ambiguity. Again, I mentioned how not everything was regulated in the poker world back 10, 15 years ago. And so you did have to kind of carve out creative ways to build trust, to establish contracts and make sure that there was alignment. And I think, again, in the worlds that I've operated in more recently, whether it's BCG or Google or GoPuff, that need is still there. And I think trying to both internally with my teams and then externally with the teams that we work with, I think if there is trust that you can kind of figure stuff out and reach alignment in situations where there's no clear path forward, I think that's another big piece of that past life that comes into play really routinely now.
Right. And nobody is comfortable with ambiguity. And it feels like the role of the manager, the leader, is to try to shelter the rest of the team as much as possible, just to allow for their confidence and their belief to remain intact. And it is a healthy dosage of smoke and mirrors saying, like, we might not have all the pieces to the puzzle just yet, but I'll make sure that my team is okay before we do get there and that we are able to take our next step. That absolutely makes sense. And I just have one more question about your past life as a poker player, because I just think it's so interesting and cool that you were able to just create a career out of that following your undergrad. But it feels like a lot of your success as a poker player is derived from your ability to read other people that you're competing against, that you're meeting, that you're playing with. And how has your experience at that table influenced at all your leadership approach over time? And do you think that as a leader that it's imperative to be able to read people?
Yeah, it's an interesting question and one that I've thought about in terms of like direct one-to-one translation to kind of the business environment. I think like certainly there's some carryover, right? Like you're sitting at a poker table and you're trying to understand the people you're around. You're trying to understand motivations and kind of what drives them. And that helps you make better decisions at the poker table. And obviously, if you're in a situation at work, more classic business context, it also helps a lot to kind of know and think about where the other team, the other person, if you're a consultant, client is coming from, right? And so I do think that there is like some overlap there. I think the other like couple pieces of the poker experience that are really relevant now, beyond just like the ability to read people, you end up touching base with like a lot of different people. I played in poker tournaments in 10 or 12 different countries. When you sit down at a table, you get all sorts of personality types. There are the other pros that are really there to grind and focus. You'll get random amateurs in certain events that are a little more freewheeling. Literally people from all over the world with all sorts of personality types. And so I think that was one overlooked piece that I at least have overlooked today, but it was like an interesting way to just meet a lot of different people. And I think paired with that, you're always thinking about what people want and motivations and trying to read goals. I think those two components combined made for like a really useful learning experience that benefits me now. And then I think the other piece that the poker experience, and this may be the most impactful for me, I think, is just kind of understanding that you can go through all the right process and do the right things, and it doesn't always end up in a good result. And I think that's something that I try to bring to my teams, that we shouldn't be too results oriented, that even in the business context, there's a lot of situations where you can make a really informed recommendation, but you don't have all the information. I mean, that's why we're brought in to tackle tough problems, is because there is no easy answer. And so be aggressive and be bold in making that recommendation. And then there isn't going to be, if we go about that in the right way and we're making the right inferences, there shouldn't be some kickback or pushback down the line if that decision ends up not working out. In poker, you just get so used to making the right decision. It's 60% of the time you win, 70% of the time you win. You just want to get yourself in those situations where you're favored to win more often than not. And in the long run, if you do that really well, it's going to benefit you and you're going to be a successful poker player. And I think the same applies kind of for the business context. And what that percentage is going to vary based off the exact challenge, but I think approaching a problem with the mindset that like, hey, let's go into this and let's do everything we can to solve it in the right way. But let's not get too hung up and too emotionally invested on the results. We shouldn't be Monday morning quarterbacking this later and saying we did a bunch of things wrong if the result doesn't work out. So I think that's the other piece of my poker time that I think honestly, like day to day, that I feel really profoundly.
Right. It's the starting on the right foot from the start and doing everything that you can in order to set you up for success later down the road. To look at every inflection point where you had a crossroads that you had to make a decisions and being proud of the decision that you made in that moment definitely makes sense. Can you share an example with us then when in an instance that you did that on your teams and it ended up not going in the direction that you wanted it to? And as a leader, what was your responsibility in changing the mentality of your teams or reiterating the fact that you should be proud of the work that you did and you can only control what you can control?
Yeah, I think the example that pops to mind immediately for me was when I was at GoPuff. I joined post-COVID. And for those that don't know, GoPuff is kind of a fast delivery player in the DoorDash, Instacart type space for groceries and such. And I was actually looking over the Denver market and so had, a cross-functional team there. And we were operating under kind of like COVID business conditions. Like business had boomed. There was a lot of success during that time at GoPuff and obviously for a lot of the industry there. And we made a lot of decisions kind of expecting that growth to continue and operating under the assumption that business, if anything, be continuing to grow. And I think from like an investment strategy standpoint and some of the places we focused, like real estate expansion, we opened up a few new locations in the Denver area at that time. Basically, everything was lined up to support a growing business. What ended up happening is post-COVID, there was a bit of an inflection point in sales and interest flatlined a bit. And so a lot of that spend went unfulfilled and the ROI on it was not what you would hope for. And so I think in that time, there was just kind of a redirection of focus and for the business at large too, not just our metro area, but thinking more broadly about how we need to shift things and adjust to a new economic climate. So I think the decisions made at that time were in growth stage and it made perfect sense. When we went back and revised plans and shifted things around, it didn't necessarily mean that all those choices made at the time were short-sighted or wrong. It just meant that we were expecting something that was realistic at the time that didn't play out. And then what's more important at that stage, right, is reworking and making sure you're being as nimble as possible with new strategy in light of that new information. So when something changes, now let's go back to the drawing board. But that was maybe one of the more impactful inflection points where things just went very differently than we'd anticipated and obviously needed to make changes from there.
Right. The outcome of pandemic is probably one of the most unpredictable landscapes that you could even imagine. So how was the mentality of the team and what were the conversations like in the boardrooms? And was everybody still being optimistic about the decisions that they've made in the past? I'm just curious to hear how the culture was inside the doors when you were moving through some of those experiences.
At different levels, it played out differently, right? So I think kind of some of like my internal team conversations were different from my larger org conversations were different from like the conversations that were happening at the top of the company. The initial kind of reaction, which is natural, is like, wow, we're not hitting targets. Why is this happening? Is there something we can do? And that impulse, I think, is the right one, right? Like, let's first see if there's something that we can change right away, or if there's something that we missed, like go back and kind of re-examine the calculus and make sure we know what's going on. So I think internally there was a bit of like, let's fix this right away. And then I just think over time, when it became clear that there was external factors driving a lot of this, it shifted the mindset from, okay, like we can do some things now, but let's not have the same expectations we had a month, 2 months, 6 months ago, right? And so that was the shift at that point that I think myself and, a lot of other folks across the company tried to facilitate was, like we're in a different environment. Let's understand that. And now let's try to approach this and make the right decisions in this new environment that are going to benefit the business the most. And I think it took time. And I think depending on the exact business situation you're talking about, like it's natural, right? To like, if a suboptimal result comes back, to react to that and to try to figure out why. And I think that process is good, but I think beating yourself up over it instead of kind of like quickly reframing and trying to think of, what the new world looks like and go from there. I think that's the kind of like inflection point where we I think at GoPuff did a pretty good job of shifting quickly. But for myself, for others, like obviously there are times where I'm sure we can all look back and kind of think about a time where we stewed a little longer than we needed to instead of moving forward and trying to adjust.
Right, right. Oh my gosh, that seems like the age-old battle. It's like just adjusting quickly and moving on as appropriately. I really liked what you said about how the experiences, depending on who was in the meeting, is going to just be a little bit different. Like it's going to be different if it's an all hands on deck. It's going to be different if it's just the marketing team, just the supply chain team, depending on what is going on within those specific functions. One of the things that I am learning a lot about leadership is your ability to have information as your currency, and depending on who the audience is, tailoring the information to not only influence that group of people to be able to do a good job at what they're doing, but to inspire them to get on the track with still being honest, right? About we're not filtering the information that is just completely untrue, being able to be transparent and still relay the accurate pieces that is specific to that team. And I am just curious, whether that be at your role at GoPuff or BCG or Google, have you been in those positions where you had information that was your currency and had to appropriately deliver it to specific teams to make sure that everybody was aligned to a common goal? And what did that look like for you?
I mean, honestly, it resonates because in my current role, this is something that's super, super important. I'm still fairly new at Google. I think I'm 8 months in now. So it's not as if I still have so much more to learn. But in my world, and my Google sphere is within Chrome OS, which is effectively Chromebooks and devices. I don't know. I've been a little bit surprised that it works this way. But being at BCG and seeing a lot of big organizations, I do think this is fairly standard where you just have information slipping through the gaps in a lot of situations, and teams are operating in their own areas, and the linkages across teams are not always as strict or as tight as you would like. And I think even something that's well structured from an org standpoint early on, as things change and as roles and responsibilities evolve, like very common, I think, for those gaps to emerge in time. And so I think that's where absolutely it's important to have that information and to be thinking constantly about like what each team needs and how you can repurpose that information, or like what part of the data and information is most relevant for that team, and making sure you're bringing it to them and surfacing it for them to get reactions. And especially I'm in the strat ops world, and sometimes you get the, hey, what do you actually do in that role? Because you don't actually have oftentimes like as clear a remit as a lot of functional areas like marketing or supply chain or whatever it may be.
Right.
And I do think one of the key value adds of a strat ops leader is kind of thinking across teams and thinking cross functionally and how you can fill some of those gaps. And so 100% at Google, I think at any large company, even if you are in a functional area, I think I've been consistently impressed with my colleagues who are doing that thinking of like, not only like what are the inputs in this conversation that matter for me and my team, but I had this conversation with someone in another part of Google the other day, and they were talking about something similar. And I think what I'm hearing actually might have an impact on them. Like, even if you haven't fully connected the dots yourself, I think just like kind of providing those dots to the different areas and working it through in real time is really valuable and a way to show leadership. So I do think it's partially the storytelling and partially like how you relay it. But I also just think like the mere accumulation of information and being interested in like the more like open your mind is to that, the more you're going to actually hear and the more you're going to be able to share out and like make those connections across teams.
Right. It reminds me of what we spoke about earlier, where you have to be good at managing in ambiguous information or situations where you don't have all of the pieces of information and on the table, and you still have to be okay with directing your teams in that very wonky space. But also when you have the capability or the opportunity to identify and plug in the holes where you can, taking the opportunity and not just letting the information pass you by because it just might not fall under your umbrella of responsibility. It seems like going the extra mile to plug those holes and make the connections where you can seem like it's pretty important and imperative just down the line, even if it's not in your job description.
Yeah, I think that's a really apt comparison, especially when you're new somewhere. I think it can feel overwhelming to be doing that task, at least in my experience. I have the luxury of knowing that or hopefully being at Google for a decent amount of time versus in the consulting context, you come in and you have 2 months, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you have even less. And so I think it can be challenging to feel like you can do some of that quickly. Again, give yourself grace, do what you can to like hear this stuff and trust that over time, those connections will start to be a little more obvious in your mind.
Yeah, yeah. And not being scared to speak up if you think you can make something or present something of value. Considering this consulting industry, it's pretty different from the rest of the industry, how the management is structured, where you're constantly, as we just said, you're cycling onto new teams, new managers, new projects. And over time, your reviews with your talent manager or whoever the equivalent of that is really speaks for itself. But I wonder, in your experience and in your opinion, on the theory of should the subordinates of the team adhere to the management style of that manager, or should the manager adapt more to the styles of the people that they're overseeing? And I think, right, that sitting here, any reasonable person would say like, oh, like it's going to be a little combination of both. It depends. It's a give and take. But what actually happened when you were at BCG? Was there a common thread of, okay, I know I can plug in. I don't have that long to adjust to these styles. So was it pretty common? Was the culture pretty cohesive throughout? Or did you have personal styles where you could adjust pretty quickly depending on what project you were onboarding to?
Yeah, I was going to give the caveat that you gave that ideally it would go both ways. So thank you for jumping ahead on that. So I think for one, in consulting, right, you want to be thinking about your client's working style first and foremost. So I would say that by and large, our consulting teams shifted our approach to match whatever worked best for our client. That wasn't always the case. I would say it should always be the case with the right boundaries and guardrails in there, but that's a starting point, I would say. Secondarily, I think honestly, one of the most impressive things about BCG is the consistency of like teaming across like geographies, across offices. And that goes not only like in the US, that goes across the world. Like I've worked with folks in Europe and Asia, and the seamlessness with which teams kind of come together, coalesce, and are able to drive results pretty quickly is pretty impressive. And so I do think that most consulting firms probably are pretty good at setting up those norms to establish kind of quick teaming capabilities, because at the end of the day, like you said, you have to do this. If you can't come together quickly as a team and work, then why would a client bring you on for a 6-8 week project? So I do think that is like maybe one of the most impressive things that I saw at BCG was the ability for folks to do that. That being said, it is ideally a give and take with team and manager. I think the best partners are the ones who were able to be receptive to feedback and see team needs and adjust on the fly. So like coming from the top of a project team down, you had this flexibility and this like willingness to adjust to, drive whatever was the best outcome for the team. I think I would say the best managers, kind of middle managers, I should say, in like the project leader principal roles at BCG, they were the ones who were able to not only take into account how their teams under them were working or wanted to work or what they needed, but also really up. And that was the big thing. If they could manage effectively the partners, that was such a kind of unburdening for the rest of the team if you didn't have to be worrying about that as, an associate or a consultant. So I think managing both ways is super useful. I think what happened in practice more often was probably if you were an associate or a consultant coming into a new setting, you wanted to learn a lot about your manager and try to adjust as much as you could to their working style. Right. But the nice piece of that, which I think is true, is that I don't think there's not as much deviation in terms of how managers worked at BCG as you would expect, or maybe like even what I've seen at GoPuff and Google and with some of my clients at BCG. I think there's just a lot more variation in how managers approach things versus at BCG, there's just kind of a box of working norms that everyone seems to operate within.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So in your experience as the project leader at BCG, can you tell us about an example where you had to manage up a little bit in order to help set the norms in a way that worked better for the team that you were on?
Yeah, so I think one example that comes to mind immediately is had a very involved partner, a relatively junior partner, so like first or second year in the role. And traditionally, like they are going to be more likely to be hyper involved. And I think it is usually a good thing when you have significant partner involvement. And I think overall, it was something that we wanted to tap into and take his expertise and his thinking as much as we could, even on a day-to-day basis. Like that was awesome to have that level of engagement.
Right.
But where I felt like I could do some work is to provide a bit of a shield for the team, because at some level, a team of associates and consultants who have a partner hovering over them might not necessarily lead to the best results. And that was actually feedback that in our kind of weekly meetings, the team brought up to me was, hey, like would be great to have a little more space. I feel like we are not able to think as much as we'd like. Also, just the iterations on the work product were coming really fast.
Right.
And so it was occasionally didn't have chances to review as much as between the team without the partner as much as we wanted. So that's where I, A, tried to communicate a lot of that in a tactful way up. But B, also like I was happy to kind of take on the role of relaying a lot of the work product and relaying thinking from the larger team up to him. So he felt like he was getting the engagement that he wanted while we also still were tapping into kind of his thinking and adjusting on the fly. But I was able to kind of absorb a lot of the back and forth versus stepping away and having that kind of direct line be a little more cumbersome for the team. So that was one obvious example where I think ultimately everyone found a way to make that work. But yeah, I think a lot of times that is a project leader role, is to find a way to do some of that.
Awesome. And through your experiences that you had doing that, do you feel more confident just moving forward, like in your roles at Google, where you see you can be a shield or you can have the uncomfortable conversation, might be uncomfortable, might not be, in order to do the right things by your team?
Yeah, honestly, that specific experience is one I think back to because that partner was like a very strong personality. It was an example of like early on, there were some bumps in the road when I was trying to execute on this, but ultimately, like I found a way to build a really strong relationship with that person. It gave me trust that if you're doing the right things and you're pushing back in the right ways and you're trying to get to the right end goal, if you do all those things in the right way, ultimately it's going to not only benefit you and your team, but it's going to benefit the working relationship with that person too. And so I think absolutely it's built a bit of a confidence in managing those types of situations.
Yeah, that's awesome. I just have one more question for you concerning your role at Google now. Google is just notorious for having this famous management and leadership publications and literature out there, some of which we go over here at Owen, right? In our leading teams and organizations class, our management, organizational effectiveness. A lot of the material and the cases that we review have been published are about Google. And I just wanted to ask you, in your role now over these past 8 months, how have you been supported playing into some of the leadership strengths that we talked about today? And is there any specific examples that you can give us that have been happening on your team now?
Yeah, God, I will say first off, Google is so big. So like people's experiences in terms of like the tangibility of this type of thing is going to vary so widely. So worth pointing that out. But honestly, in my team right now, we've been having a lot of really open conversations, mostly kind of in the soft skill building and just like we've moved away from as much content review and tried to shift more towards teaming and how we work together and how we listen and how we think about working with other teams. And this cuts to like Google's focus on teaming and on leadership. But we do have like a kind of a handful of internal series for different cohorts. And you basically have coaches who kind of help with that. And there's someone on my team who went through one of these recently. He's brought back a lot of learnings, and we actually had his coach come and kind of talk to the team. And I think the one thing that he brought to us that we've been talking a lot about that I think is super, super interesting and important, and it's not like earth shattering, but I do think just having an awareness of this has changed my last couple of months. And it's really just thinking about the tone in a room. If you can create this like comfortable, open transparency with the people that you're working with, like where people feel comfortable sharing. And like we've done exercises where everyone kind of pulls a card with hard questions on it and you have to share something. You have to put the card back if you don't feel like your answer is something that you normally would feel uncomfortable sharing with your team or in the workplace. And so it's just designed to kind of build this like openness and ability to connect with colleagues. And I think the kind of macro implication of that is like when you have a tone in the room where people trust, it's optimistic, there's no like concern about being wrong, that's when the best results happen. And that's when you actually like move forward. Whereas whenever we've all been in those meetings where you can feel the underlying tension, you feel like there's something not being said that is inhibiting the conversation and inhibiting the push forward. So I think just thinking about that, and like we've talked about a number of tactics to kind of like bring the tone in the room back to think about that. But yeah, I think just being mindful of that. And if you kind of feel, especially like, if you're talking about cross-functional stakeholders that you're not working as closely with day to day, that it's, you're maybe interfacing with them once every couple of weeks. And yeah, just finding subtle ways to kind of make that tone lighter, make it more comfortable, establish safe spaces. I think that's just been a really interesting piece of our conversation as a team recently.
Yeah, that's awesome. Oh, that is so relatable to not even only in the workplace, but even in classrooms or at parties or when you're going on a first date with somebody. Like there is that palpable underlying tone of this is either working or it's not working. And I think that that's a really great thing to keep in mind, that as long as everybody does feel comfortable coming to the table with a certain level of psychological safety, then the productivity of whatever that conversation is going to be unstoppable compared to a room where people are a little bit more timid.
Yep. You can have the best answer in the world. And I think if you're not able to kind of discuss it and feel comfortable in that room, like it's not going to matter. So absolutely agree.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And I know, Bennet, I said that was the last question, but I actually lied. I have one more for you. Just in terms of you reflecting back and advice to your younger self coming out of Owen, for the students that are listening, for the alumni that are listening, what is just one piece of advice that you would want to give to your younger self when graduating from this great place and starting your career? What would it be?
For me, it would just be trust that the discomfort will lead to really good things. For me, coming from primarily a very non-traditional background, entering BCG, this like kind of big corporate behemoth, it was really nerve-wracking and it felt really weird for the first 6 to 12 months and like very uncomfortable. And I think now looking back, I'm so grateful for that. And I think without the discomfort and without kind of like having to adjust and having to push myself a lot, I don't think I'd feel as comfortable in the roles since. So I think no matter what you end up doing post Owen, hopefully it is something that, in various ways gives you the chance to stretch and push yourself in areas that you haven't necessarily pushed before. Because I think like a little of that. And I think honestly, like that's part of the Owen experience in some ways too, right? Like you come in and there's a lot of that. And depending on what you pursue job wise, what you pursue curriculum wise, like there's a lot of opportunities for that growth. And I think just like bringing that out and knowing that like it's all going to work out in the end, even as you're sifting through that discomfort, I think that would be my biggest call out.
Yeah. That's awesome. That is great to know. Well, thank you so much for your time this morning. It was great getting to chat with you again. I'm definitely looking forward to keeping in touch, wishing you all the best at your role at Google, and we'll hopefully talk to you soon.
Thanks so much, Brie. Really, really enjoyed it. And looking forward to catching up in the future.
All right, Bennet, have a good one.
Thanks. See ya.